Welcome to another wonderful experience in experimental analysis of behavior. Today we're going to be talking about habituation and latent inhibition and why those are so critical in classical conditioning. And so let me see if I can share my screen here. And we are going to go back here, maybe to the beginning. And we are going to figure out what exactly is learned during classical conditioning. And this is based on some work by Hall and Rodriguez in 2017. I put the citation there if you're interested in reading more about this. So in classical conditioning, we have to consider our stimuli. In classical conditioning, the animal typically learns a stimulus-stimulus pairing, right? The CS relatively reliably predicts some other stimulus, the US. The US reliably elicits some response, the UR. And because of the relationship between the two stimuli, this predictive nature of the CS predicting the US, the animal begins to react to the CS with another response called the conditioned response. Sometimes this conditioned response is related to the original unconditioned response. Sometimes it's opposite or compensatory. Sometimes it's as strong as the unconditioned response. Sometimes it's equal, and sometimes it's weaker. In habituation, what happens in habituation is you learn to pay less attention to the stimulus, typically because it doesn't have meaning. So in most stimulus presentation situations, the response that is shown to be repeatedly presented over and over and over, attention is reduced or weakened to that stimulus, even with repeated pairings. And in fact, because of the repeated pairings. So one consider habituation to be the reduced ability of the stimulus to evoke a response. Think of your mother calling you. Right? At your age, you no longer pay any attention to her at all. So in Pavlovian conditioning, an unconditioned response that is initially evoked by a US can interfere with the conditioned response or get in the way of the development of a CR. That's interesting. Any response that occurs to an original stimulus prior to conditioning could be habituated, or it could be extinguished even. So the animal learns not to attend to it, and with extinction, it learns not to attend to it at all. So that original stimulus becoming a CS, predicting a US, occurs, we get this what they call latent inhibition. The conditioned response is typically a response within the family of responses that support the unconditioned response. So when we get the CS-US prediction, the CS that elicits that CR is typically going to be part of the family of responses that are related to the unconditioned stimulus. Any other responses become irrelevant to the current learning situation, so that if I'm going to get food, I salivate, I don't stand up and turn around. Why? Because standing up and turning around isn't related to getting food. And so those other behaviors that aren't related to food should be habituated, and the food-related behaviors are now elicited. In drugs, that could be a compensatory response, but it's still going to be a compensatory response that's related to the upcoming drug event, and other responses get habituated. So what we're really doing is habituating unrelated responses and having the animal focus on important responses and important stimuli that cue those responses. And so we get habituation of irrelevant responses. That's great. But sometimes we get habituation of a conditioned response that's reflective of a change in the effective properties of the predictive stimulus. We don't want that. That's called habituation. So now you've learned that the CS predicts food. But now the CS predicting food is presented to you ad nauseum. And you lose interest, so to speak, and you stop showing your CR. So we're getting habituation. Well, why do you stop paying attention to the CR or to the CS if it predicts food? Why do you stop making that CR? Understanding how and why a CR might become habituated helps us understand what the animal is learning during classical conditioning. It also helps us understand how an animal learns to ignore irrelevant stimuli, and it helps us understand what the animal considers predictive and relevant. So we have to look at some of the parameters of classically conditioned habituation? When does it occur? Well, repeated presentations of a CS followed by a US results in the CS evoking a reliable CR. Great. So there's a supposed formation of an associative link between the central representation of the CS and the US stimuli. So we assume that the presentation of the conditioned stimulus produces activity in its representation node and also activity in the US node. So the CS predicting the US says, oh, I see the light. Oh, that predicts food. I'm thinking of both the light and the food. This allows a formation of the link between the CS and the US. Now, if I just present the CS alone, the activation of the CS node results in the conditioned response because I'm expecting the US to occur. And if I initially present the CS alone, there's no CS-US activation, and extinction occurs eventually because I go, oh, there's the light, but there's not food. So as I deactivate the US activation that would occur to that CS, my CR disappears because I don't have that co-activation mode. And that's kind of the idea of classical conditioning, extinction, and habituation is what happens post-asymptotically. So after the animal has learned the situation, it shows habituation. It gets a decrement in responding where it had responded before. So why shouldn't the repeated CS-US pairing produce habituation? I'm repeatedly presenting two stimuli. Shouldn't that weaken the activation of those modes? Well, in most situations in classical conditioning, we don't see strong habituation, which is puzzling because it should by definition, right? We learn to ignore your mother. Why don't you learn to ignore the CS and predicting the food? After a while, you stop paying attention to it and it stops being important. Or does it? And that's the question. Why doesn't it? Well, possibility one is that habituation occurs so slowly that the association reached at asymptote is not actually ever complete, and the CS always retains some power to activate the node. So with very extensive training, we do see some habituation begin to occur, but oftentimes, even in the lab, it takes a very long time for that to happen. Possibility two is that the context in which the two stimuli are presented plays a critical role. Right? How are they presented? Under what circumstances? And extended conditioning can augment the associative strength of the cues that define the context in which training is given. Because it's rare that the actual training context would be completely identical trial to trial. And learning to have those different cues and the CS being the best predictor is going to be important. So those cues play a modulatory role that control the degree of responding to the CS. Yes, background noise happens, but that light always predicts food. Possibility three is that there could be inhibitory learning during the repeated trials. There could be some slow learning. A post-asymptotic decline could reflect the occurrence of some form of inhibitory learning. So the learning opposes the excitation that was established during my initial conditioning. Oh, the light predicts food. Oh, something else is happening now. That should result in a decrease in responding, but it may also result in a shift or refinement of responding. So what looks like a decrement in responding may actually not be. And temporal discrimination shows this. So typically in an experiment, you'd have a CSB of a prolonged period. So say the tone plays for 2 minutes before the shock happens. Well, what happens with repeated trials is the animal stops responding with some kind of freezing behavior. It stops lever pressing at the beginning or the onset of the tone. Instead, it waits for those last few seconds of the tone that predict. So if I've got 120 seconds of tone, it waits 100 seconds, and only in the last 20 seconds of tone does it show the CR. Why? Because those last 20 seconds are more predictive than the first 100 seconds. So this isn't a loss of effectiveness of the CS. It's actually enhanced control of the CS, which is looking like habituation. It's not habituation. It's actually better conditioning. Possibility 4. The decrease in post-asymptotic responding is due to the properties of the US changing with extended training. So we get some perceptual changes. Repeated presentation of the shock may reduce its perceived aversiveness, which is another form of habituation. So I'm getting habituation to the US. And as a result, my compensatory changes may occur. So now I've got my drug. This is what can happen. So the drug produces effect of 10. My CR is an opponent process to the UR. It goes -10 because the US is 10, right? It changes its behavior and it washes out the effectiveness of the US. So the US is less salient, and so I get a smaller CR to it. So what's the take home here? Well, repeated presentation of the pair of stimuli, the CS and the US, in a standard classical conditioning procedure can result in habituation sometimes. And the sometimes is what's critical. We know that the habituation is due to a reduction in the salience of a stimulus. But is it due to the reduction of the salience of the US or the CS? And how is the CR and the UR affected? And when this happens, how does it happen, and when and where? And those are the intriguing questions. So there are several models and theories that kind of attack this. And we can go back first to McIntosh, 1975, Pearson Hall, 1980, and their associative models of classical conditioning, where they really are looking at how the animal pays attention to CSs. So they're association theories that are extensions of Rescorla-Wagner. They're not arguing that Rescorla-Wagner are wrong. They're arguing that Rescorla-Wagner is incomplete. And they say the ability of a CS to command processing depends on how it predicts its consequences. And a presentation of the CS in US change on the associative strength of the CS as a signal for the US, and in the value of alpha, or the associability or conditionability of the CS. So the alpha, the index of effectiveness of the CS, may not stay constant throughout repeated trials. Instead, the value of the CS will increase for a CS that's a good or best predictor of consequences, and the value of that CS, that alpha value, will decrease when it's a poor or poorest predictor. So, McIntosh's 1975 model of attention simply says a good predictor commands greater attention where a poor one does not. It emphasizes the role in acquisition or learning, but it also applies it to post-asymptotic trials of performance. Well, this is interesting. It suggests that what happens in learning is one situation, but you also get changes in performance post-asymptotically, which is really, really an interesting idea. Oh, the animal has to learn, but then the animal also has to perform. So let's look at some post-stimulus effects of habituation. If repeated presentations of the stimulus normally produce habituation, when does this fail? When do we not get habituation? The only difference between habituation and conditioning, excuse the dogs, is that during conditioning, the stimulus of interest is followed by another salient event. In habituation, the stimulus of interest, our target CS, doesn't predict anything. So could the salience of the US prevent habituation? Well, yeah. How good a shock is it? But whether this happens or not depends on the response and the stimulus. It has to do with the type of event it is. And we see two genre or family of responses in classical conditioning. We get orienting responses, or exactly what they say, where the animal orients towards the predictive stimulus. And we get behavioral orienting, head turns, and so on, body changes in position towards a predictive stimulus. And we also get a set of autonomic changes responsive to that stimulus, depending on what it predicts. So if it's predicting cheesecake, I get much more excitation than if that stimulus is predicting lettuce. But we also have defense responses, which are responses evoked by an intense or an aversive stimulus. So we get the bracing, I get the freezing, I get the eye blinks, I get those kinds of defensive responses that occur. And the UR and CR responses differ depending on whether an OR or a DR are elicited. So whether that unconditioned or conditioned response elicited an oriented response or a defensive response can change the strength of the CS-US conditioning over time and with repeated presentations of the stimulus pairing. Defense responses do habituate with repeated presentations. The rat freezes less and less to the shock. The shock seems to habituate, and so the UR is attenuated with repeated trials, and the CR to the shock also seems to attenuate. Orienting responses do not habituate with repeated presentations, and in the CS-US relationship, the US of the CS-US presentation seems to be the limiting factor for the development of habituation. And why? Well, it has to do with the functional significance of the orienting response in comparison to the defense response. The orienting response is attentional. It provides a mechanism for controlling changes in information processing. It's used to maintain or enhance the organism's attention to certain stimuli, even if they're overly familiar. If it's the best predictor, I'm going to pay attention to it. Or it tends to be maintained when the subject is uncertain about outcomes of the eliciting stimulus. I pay attention to it to see if this time it is important, or maybe it's the most important in a variety of context cues. So unreliable CSs maintain or enhance the orienting response, where very reliable CSs maintain the orienting response less. So if you want the animal to pay attention, do not have your CS-US relationship be a perfect 1.0 correlation. You want it to be, data show that about a 0.6, 0.7 will get great orienting responses because the animal orients towards it to see if it's going to be predictive this time. All right? Well, other post-stimulus events can affect habituation, and this has to do with, again, our pre-exposure effect. So again, the pre-exposure effect is I present a neutral stimulus alone, and then I use that neutral stimulus as a CS. And learning tends to be slower in general than if I just use the neutral stimulus as a CS without that prior exposure. So latent inhibition occurs when a stimulus that has undergone habituation training and is then used as a CS reduces the rate of learning in that new classical conditioning situation. And again, we can explain this by the attentional models. There's lower attention to the new CS if I've pre-exposed it because the animal's actually learned something about that stimulus. And what it's learned is, oh, it predicts nothing. And now when it predicts something, I have to change that node or that circuit which has been activated. That, oh, it doesn't mean anything circuit has to now be left alone. Interestingly, it's not worn out, it's not forgotten, but a new circuit has to be formed. Interestingly, the old circuit is still there. So this gets really more complicated. The effect depends on the type of the CR elicited, whether it's an orienting response or a defensive response. It depends on whether the CS is highly predictive or only somewhat predictive. And the US and the UR also matter. What is the CS predicting? Highly salient USs, bigger shocks, support more unconditioned responding, and this affects the importance of the salience and can overcome this pre-exposure or latent inhibition effect. Well, can you get habituation of the US during conditioning? It depends. Why do researchers use highly salient USs like shock during conditioning? You don't see a whole lot of food used. Well, because highly salient USs don't habituate. It offsets the habituation effects, and I don't have that as a confound in my studies. But we can show that the CS preceding the US influences habituation to the US. And this is called conditioned diminution. I cannot say this word today. Diminution of the UR. The UR generally declines as the CR becomes stronger. What? Yeah, the CR is having a deleterious effect on the UR. And Wagner in 1981 suggested that the associative activation of a US representation by a CS will reduce the response of that representation when the US then occurs. So the CS elicits a representation or a memory of the upcoming US. And when the US actually occurs, the memory of that US is less because the attention is on the CS. And this is a motivational arousal. If I get really excited during the CS, in a sense, all my excitation has occurred to the CS, and I don't have any left to do to the US. And I think the best way you can explain this is Christmas. All the cues are coming for Christmas. I'm a little kid and Christmas is coming. Christmas is coming. They started now even before Halloween, but the day after Halloween used to be the day after Thanksgiving. And so we have these 2 months long worth of bombarding with Christmas is coming, Christmas is coming. I'm excited. I see Santa. There are all these intermediary events. My Christmas concert has to occur. That means Christmas is getting closer. School's out. Christmas is getting closer. And I get excited, excited, excited. Christmas actually comes. And it's almost a letdown. It's less than all the excitement that has occurred before. And so now that CR has actually become bigger than the UR, and that can cause some real context changes. And this affects the elicitation of both the CR and the UR. If the CR and the UR are very similar, then I don't get habituation. Or I do get habituation. I'm sorry, I get habituation when they're very similar. But when they're very different, I don't get habituation. And this is why you don't habituate, in a sense, to Christmas, because you have all these context cues that are constantly changing that predict this event. And so I don't habituate that way. Although as an adult, I think we get a little habituation because we know that Christmas isn't all that exciting, right? But as a little kid, each year you get excited. And think, well, didn't you learn that last year it was going to be a letdown? Nope, this year you hope it's not going to be. Kind of a Christmas story effect. He always hopes that he's not going to get the pink bunny suit. He always hopes he's going to actually get the Red Ryder BB gun. All right, let's look at some pre-stimulus effects. We looked at some post-stimulus. Let's look at some pre-stimulus. In a CS-US pairing, the US can influence the CS. So what if the US is not a great motivator? It's not of significance. It's a wimpy CS. Well, or US. A weak US is unlikely to provide a CS with the ability to evoke a CR. And it looks like the data look like habituation's happened, but it's not so much habituation. It's not that I'm less responsive to the CS. It's that the US is not actually eliciting any excitation in the CS. And so there are actually no CR happening. And again, Wagner's 1976 model really notes this role of context and conditioning. And he notes that a node that represents a given stimulus is less responsive to the occurrence of a stimulus when that node has been recently activated. So what? Well, if I keep activating the node, in a sense, the node habituates. So the presentation of the CS alone should result in habituation for the US, right? I'm overactivating the node. And this affects the ability of the CS to elicit a conditioned response because the US is weakened. So frequent CS-US exposure to shock more quickly habituates your shock experience. The shock quickly loses its value, and the CR becomes affected because the UR is weakened. Interesting. Okay. And again, we can look at some experiments that assess the UR. And in a preconditioning situation, we can give the rat 2 different flavors presented in succession. And then we use one flavor as the CS to predict a US. And we can decrease habituation by this pre-stimulus pairing by exposing the animal to another flavor prior to introducing the CS. And it eliminates or reduces that habituation effect because I've altered the context, right? So you got the 2 flavors paired together, blah, 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 blah. Okay, we're getting some pre-exposure effect. But now I have the US be a totally different flavor to predict and elicit a UR. That change in context then gives me a bigger excitation to the CS predictor, and I get a strong CR. But only if I change the flavor of the US. Here's another really interesting indirect measure of context effects, but done by Lubal et al. In 1976, where he used a pre-exposure effect of the US. So we had the rat's blubber press. And all they got was a tone. So I pressed my lever, beep. I pressed my lever, beep. Okay, you got it. So now the lever pressing response and the set of stimuli associated with lever pressing occurred as a preconditioning. And then they used the tone as a CS for shock. Okay, so lever pressing predicts the tone. Now the tone is used as a predictor for shock. The control animals who only got trained to tone predicting shock learned very quickly. Of course, tone predicts shock. The animals who received the lever pressing tone trials learned less readily. They learned more slowly than the control group. So that exposure of lever pressing tone did cause some inhibition. The learning didn't occur as fast. The control group that received the tone as an actual pre-exposure to the CS-US pairing did show the slowest amount of learning. They showed this normal latent inhibition. But even though the tone was a consequence, not a predictor. Now think about it, lever pressing, and then the consequences of the tone. Tone is a consequence in that precondition, and then is used as a predictor in the next pairing, for the CS-US pairing for shock. So the tone is changed from a consequence to a predictor, and that still interferes with learning. That's interesting. So that even though the tone was in a different situation, in a different context, it still has some carryover to the new learning situation. The type of the UR matters. Nausea is very resistant to habituation. And episodes of nausea that occur early in training are likely as equally aversive as those experienced during later training. I don't think we really ever habituate to nausea. But other aversive events do habituate. Things like shock, which is continuous cutaneous pain, finger flicks, pressure tests habituate. Food responses are even less resistant to habituation. They habituate very quickly. And I can ask you, is the first bite of cheesecake as good as the 27th bite of cheesecake? Probably not. Why? Well, probably because you are habituating to the taste of cheesecake. And so repeated presentations of the food affect its salience. So as the salience declines for the US of food, that affects how good the predictor is. CS remains a good predictor, but what it's predicting is something wimpy. And so the animal pays less attention to this CS because it's a wimpy predictor. And this is kind of the Thanksgiving dinner effect. We see this in food habituation, where you eat all that turkey dinner, you eat it, all the potatoes and the gravy and the stuffing and the sweet potatoes and the rolls, and oh, you're stuffed, you couldn't eat another bite. And oh my goodness, you're full. And your mother comes in and says, anybody want pie? And you all eat pie. Well, how could you eat pie if you were so full? And the answer is, you weren't actually sated. You could still eat more, but you were habituated to the flavor of turkey. Turkey had lost its value, and a novel stimulus, a sweet stimulus in comparison to the savory stimuli of the typical Thanksgiving dinner, ended up causing a change in the stimulus conditions, and all of a sudden, pie was more salient, and you could eat pie. Very interesting, because food seems to undergo habituation more than it actually undergoes satiety. We stop eating something because we've habituated to it, and the predictor cues of something that we're habituated to change in their value because they're predicting something of lesser value. All right. We can also have situations where the animal is taught stimulus, no event learning effects, and this is a latent inhibition. Again, so habituation training for the original stimulus that is then used as a CS reduces the rate of learning in that CS-US pairing. But we can do some generalization tests for latent inhibition. So say I've trained to a tone, and the tone is middle C. Okay? Now I can try variations of middle C to see if the animal responds or does not respond to it. So if I've got habituation to middle C, will I also show habituation to the C above middle C, the C below middle C? How far out do I get in my octaves before the animal sees it as a different stimulus. What about an A or a G on the piano? What about a buzzer? Is that process the same? So again, when does the stimulus no longer be the stimulus? How much of a change or how much context do I have? The dog learns sit at your house. Can he sit in the training room? Maybe yes, maybe no. It depends on what the animal is paying attention to. If the animal is attending to you and you are the predictor of the word sit, means if I do it, I get a piece of candy or doggy treat, then the animal will do it. If the animal is learning that you in the particular room is the salient CS, then when you change, now generalization occurs. And we have to be aware of these effects on the pre-stimulus setting and how that can affect generalization and the elicitation of a CS-US pairing, and therefore the strength of both the UR and the CR. And the CR is what we're interested in. So we can make some general conclusions here. Hallelujah, we're finally getting to conclusions. We know that changes in salience of the CS during exposure to the US is modulated by the conditioning procedure itself. So changing up the conditioning procedure alters how well we get a conditioned response. And altering the type of event, the quality of the CS, the quality of the US, doing a pre-exposure effect to the CS of the US, all affect how well the animal learns, how fast the animal learns in latent inhibition, and how much habituation we get on post-asymptotic trials. And these effects have relevance for transfer of learning and stimulus processing because it tells us what the animal attends to, and it demonstrates the importance of context. And we can make some guiding principles. Changes in associability and changes in salience obey different rules. Changes in associability are things that original learning interferes with new learning. So latent inhibition is an associability effect. Blocking, overshadowing are associability effects. The mode of the CR matters in terms of the orienting response or the defense response. Those affect how well the animal is attending to the situation. Animals attend more for orienting responses. Defense responses are more preparatory responses to the US and may change with time. On the other hand, changes in salience are changes in the value of the CS in the US. And the value of the CS in the US, the salience of the CS in the US, determine the strength of the CS. And we get acquired distinctiveness. Stimuli which are distinctive produce stronger conditioned responses. Learned predictiveness. Stimuli which are the best predictors produce stronger conditioned responses. So if I want a really strong conditioned response, I'm going to not have any latent inhibition. I'm going to use an orienting response, and I'm going to make sure that I emphasize acquired distinctiveness and then learned predictiveness in my CS and my US pairings, and that should get me a very strong CR. So we can make some general principles. An organism given a novel predictive stimulus or event must pay attention to the novel event to determine what it signals, right? Danger is different than food. In simple habituation, the stimulus or event signifies nothing of importance and attention is reduced. In conditioning, that stimulus does have consequence and attention must be maintained. Once the relation between the CS and the US is fully included, we're at asymptote, the attention for learning can be turned off. Attention for learning. But that stimulus must not be ignored. We need to keep paying attention to the stimulus to evoke responding that's appropriate to the consequence. So attention for performance must be maintained. So now we can distinguish between learning, which is pre-asymptotic, and performance, which is post-asymptotic. Similar things are going to affect both, but the effects are going to be different because one is learning and one is performance. So now I want you to take that and apply it to our 3 readings this week. What about the human familiarization and training program with the dogs? What stimuli were used to predict what events? What were the military dogs learning about the stimuli and appropriate response during the HFTP? What did control dogs learn? Which dogs be likely to show habituation to fearful and aggressive stimuli, and why? Under what conditions should they show fear and aggression? Again, take a look at the study, and I think you'll see, look at the stress levels and habituation. For the children with anxiety experiment, what stimuli were used to predict what events before and then during the experiment? How did the researchers attempt to change the responses? And was this a form of habituation to fear? And did it work? Go back to our general principles, go back to kind of our rules, and see if they were consistent with the rules. And finally, for horses in fear, first of all, see if you can find the error in the description of classical conditioning. Look for their definition of overshadowing and blocking. Second, what kind of stimuli predict fear in horses? And how did the authors suggest you could reduce fear in horses? Using our general principles, are their suggestions correct? Do you think it'll work? And so that's what I want you to focus on. And now do you see why attention to the CS and the US can be so important? Why habituation and latent inhibition can be so important? It can affect the strength of the response, and it affects how we attend and to what we attend. And that can be really important if I'm trying to do learning. Pip's telling me it's time to go, isn't it? Yep, Pip. Are you done? Are you done? Are you telling me that the stimuli are such that we should be finished? Well, I kind of agree. But it tells us what we pay attention to. And if we're trying to teach people, say, not to be afraid, we need to be very careful how we're teaching them so that we can maximize generalization and minimize disruptions in their learning that fear is not a problem in this current situation. All right? Enough? We'll talk on Thursday. Have a good week. Say bye, Pip. Pip says goodbye. Honey?